Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski. Today on the podcast, we're with a cold weather runner in a cold weather coat, a historian who started right at the beginning of the decade of the 70s, who documented a long history of successful running in Minnesota many decades before that. Welcome today on the podcast, Paul Hall. Hi, Paul.
Hey, hi, Matthew.
Paul, let's talk about your personal early life. When did you first get involved with competitive sports?
I started with competitive sports way back since I can remember, almost since I could walk. I still love baseball. Growing up in northern Wisconsin and then moving to Minneapolis, I couldn't wait for the snow to melt so I could play baseball. Growing up in the neighborhood, we played whatever the sport of the season was. We'd play baseball or softball all summer. And then around August, somebody would break out of football and then we'd start playing touch football. And when you get into the winter time, we would start getting the skates out and we'd start playing hockey. In 1970, I started 10th grade. In homeroom, my teacher was Bob Hoisington. He said, now boys, you should get into some type of an extracurricular, either sports or something. The only sport right now in the fall is either football or cross country. I was sitting next to this guy I just met, Mark Holland. I said, so what in the hell's cross country? And Southwest had this rich tradition of having these great cross country teams. And I had no idea what in the world it was. He says, why don't you come on out? I'm running for it. Cause he was new to the school. He didn't even go to the junior high. He went to a different junior high. I'm sure coach will take you. So I went up to him after homeroom. I said, can I come out for cross country? I said, I don't know what it is, but can I come out? He says, yeah, sure. And so I went out, got my little bumper tennis shoes on. I didn't even have running shoes. Went to practice, went through a couple of practices. And I think I still had the bumper tennis shoes when 4 days later ran my first meet. And it was a 3-mile meet. He was coaching what we called the B squad, which was the third team. You had varsity, which is the top 7, JV, which is the next 7. They were running with Coach Halley. He was the man. And then Coach Hoisington had everybody else. He was trying to keep people interested so that they would eventually at some point move up to the varsity, hopefully. But also he didn't want to lose anybody. Plus, he just wanted everybody to be out there doing something. That he had a rich history of coaching track at a different high school in Minneapolis. He won 3 state championships with Central High School. The first meet, and this is what I always told my runners when I started coaching. They go, I don't know how good I am. I go, listen, you can't be any worse than I was when I started running. And they're like, wait, you were a good runner. Yes, I was. Eventually, I became a good runner. I was horrible. So this was a B squad meet. Nowadays, when you run cross country, unless you're one of these teams that has 75 kids out, everybody runs in all the meets except for the big invitationals when you just run your top 7. It's a weekday meet. Everybody runs and you're running against everybody. And there's nobody there that we hold these guys up because they're too good or whatever. Just everybody runs. This was just a B squad meet. That means there was no JV or varsity runners in this meet. I finished dead last for our team and dead last in the race. And I don't even remember what my time was, but it's like 24, 25 minutes or something. I remember it was getting dark when I finally finished because it was after school. If I had the attitude I've seen with some kids nowadays, which is one of the reasons why I don't coach anymore, where, if I'm not great to start off with, I suck and I don't want to do this, I would have quit. But I thought about it logically for a minute and I said, you know what? I've had 3 days of practice. I'm just learning what in the heck this sport is. I'm going to give it a shot. My dad went out and got me a pair of running shoes and I finished the season. I actually got my time down to 19:18. I broke 20 minutes for 3 miles my first year. Didn't go to any morning practices or anything, just afternoon practices. The next spring, ran track. I was going to play baseball. And my teammates pulled me aside and go, "You run cross country in the fall, you run track in the spring." Oh, okay. All right. Whatever. Sounds good. So I started running
Well,
track.
at that point, your first year, cross country and then track, did you start thinking of yourself as a runner?
I actually did. I had a little bit of, first of all, I started beating people. And secondly, because I thought way back, phys ed class back in ninth grade, and you do the presidential physical fitness thing. The only thing that was anywhere resembling a run was a 600-yard run or 660 yard. When I ran that, I finished like fourth in the whole class. And the only three guys that beat me, turns out they were running cross country. I didn't know that at the time, but they were runners. So I started having a little bit of success. At the end of my sophomore year in track, I was the sophomore city mile champ. Now, it wasn't a real fast time. It was 5:05. Some of the really good runners didn't run that day, but still, that was their choice. So I was the sophomore city mile champ. And I was like, I actually think I can do this. Coach Halley retired after that year. Our coach was going to take over as a cross country coach. And so the guy who was captain, he called me, said, "You're going to put your mileage in this summer." Yeah, sure. He said, "We have captain's practices at 9 o'clock in the morning." To me, that was a little early in the morning, but I was getting out and starting to run. And I was also caddying at the local golf course. After I got done caddying one day, we were playing softball, head on collision with a friend of mine, broke my collarbone, laid up for 8 weeks, couldn't run, couldn't do anything for 8 weeks. Basically screwed my chances of making varsity the next year, because we had an unwritten rule at Southwest, which was if you're going to be on the top 7, you need to break 16 minutes for 3 miles. If you can't break 16 minutes, you're probably not going to be in the top 7. Still recovering from broken collarbone, I started practice again in August. Still didn't make it to too many morning practices, but I made all the afternoon practices and got my time down to 17:16 for 3 miles. So I improved 2 minutes. It's just that everybody else did too. And so I was on the JV. My coach saw something, because when we went to the state meet that year, I was an alternate at the state meet as a junior. My coach said, "You know what? I have a feeling you might be here as a runner next year. You'll be one of the 7 guys running. So that's why I'm putting you on here." Because there was a lot of guys on the JV that were better than me. But so he put me on. Next spring, did okay. That summer, my friend Mark says to me, "You know what? We need a 7th man next year." And I said, "Yeah, I came to the same conclusion. We need a 7th man." He said, "I think you're it." I said, "I'd like to be." And he said, "Okay, then I'm going to take you under my wing." He was a much better runner than I was. And we ran together most of the summer. Now, he still did some of his workouts with other folks, and I still did some of mine on my own. But we pretty much ran every day, twice a day, all summer. I put in my 800 and however many miles it was that summer. We get to practice the first day. So going into fall 72, I had no clue where I stood. I just knew that I had improved a lot because I'd run with Mark all summer. We started running, and right away I established myself in the top 7. And I moved up to as high as number 5. We had an injury on the team that kept me like 5 or 6. And the guy who had the injury came back for the state meet. I ended up beating him, which was significant because I actually out sprinted him in the state meet. Considering the fact that it was, the year after that, he set the state record in the 800 meters, and it stood for 15 years. And I out sprinted him. Of course, it would help that 2 guys cut him off as I went, and he couldn't get around. He was a lot bigger than I was. He didn't get through like I did, but I ended up being the 5th man on the state championship team.
Let me ask you about your awareness of the school's success history and the running world in general. There in 1972, it was just starting to break the public's consciousness that running wasn't some oddball thing. When did you become aware of the school's history Was it something the coaches talked about, the other students? How'd you find out about that? And did you feel like a pioneer? How was it in Minneapolis?
The coaches kept telling us about the history of the school. And then some of the older runners would come and talk to you, the ones that had graduated. Because every time we go to the state meet, these guys would all show up with their letter jackets on, go, "Oh, I remember that guy." And they would say, "Look, we don't want to not be successful, so let's go." And we got reminded of how many state championships they had won. Overall, we knew that we were just getting into the running boom, because I remember when we would run in the streets and stuff, we had cars that would drive by and yell stuff at us. "What are you guys doing? Get a horse. What is going on here?" Obscenities at us and stuff like that. Like, why are you doing 72 was an Olympic year. And so we were keeping track of who the good runners were in 72, and Frank Shorter and all those guys. And I had a much keener outlook on how to watch running. And when I watched the Olympics, I watched track and field much more closely than I used to. I patterned my running style after Steve Prefontaine, because I know he liked to just get out and go, and he didn't care about who he was running against or where he was running. He just said, "I'm going to go out. I'm going to do this. Beat me. And if you beat me, great, but you're going to have to run your eyeballs out to do it." And so I had the same attitude when I ran. You find out real quickly running in this program that it's a really good program, not only because coach was telling us that, but when we would show up at meets, everybody wanted to know what we were doing. And they're paying really close attention to what we were doing, and just in general, paying close attention to us. We had this big target on our backs all the time.
Sure. How did you feel competing inside your own team, trying to make the top 7 and competing against other people? How was
Hang on.
that?
It's funny because I had no idea when I started my senior year where I was going to be. But once we started practice, then I realized that I was there. I thought, okay, I got to keep up with these guys. I can't slack off. I was doing well. Coach was nice. He goes, "Looks like Paul got a little tough on us over the summer." I looked who I was running against. There's 3 of us that were in the same area: Scott Landis, Scott Johnson, and me. And after our first meet, I decided, I didn't tell anybody. I just made this internal goal. I was never going to lose to Scott Johnson that year, because
That
I
sounds
knew.
very competitive. That sounds very competitive, but
Yeah,
goal oriented anyhow. Yeah.
yeah, and not only that, but it's funny because he is the guy who would pick me up every morning and go to practice. He'd drive by, pick me up, we'd go to practice. And but at the same time, I'm like, he's not going to beat me. I'm never going to let him beat me. And he did. He did not beat me all season, because we had a top 8. And I knew that the number was 7. You only run 7 people in the big meets. And I didn't want to be the odd man out. And I knew that coach was not just going to put me up there because I was one of the 3 seniors on the team. I still had to earn my spot. And so I was like, no, I just don't want Scott to beat me. And he never did. Matter of fact, he never broke 16 minutes for 3 miles that year. He ran 16:02 was his best time. Mine was 15:46. I finally broke 16 minutes. That was a terrible course. It was a golf course, and it was just all up and down. There was no flat pieces to this course at all. You either flying downhill or killing yourself going uphill. The whole course was like that. I knew that, like, our top 4 guys probably wasn't going to make the top 4. It's too bad that I got hurt that year before, because if I hadn't, I probably would have been in that top 4. That happens. But I wanted to make sure I maintained my spot. I beat Scott Landis a couple times. He beat me a couple times. He established himself as number 5. I was number 6. And then when Lieb came back, Scott Johnson was the odd man out. And I ended up beating both Lieb and Landis at the state meet. Ended up being number 5 guy.
The team had this long history, maybe the longest state championship streak of any school. What was your team's success in those 3 years at the state meet?
When I started running in 1970, I was on the B squad. That was the second year that they won the state title. Then Hallie retired and Hoisenden took over. When I was a junior, we won the state title again for the third year in a row. When I was a senior, we won it for a fourth year in a row. And one of our motivations that year was me and John Czar and Mark Holland. We were the three seniors. I was like, there is no way in hell we're going to screw up the streak when we're seniors. And we didn't. John was the top runner. All three of us were in the top five. And we wound up being undefeated state champions. We knew the next year that unless they got hit by a bunch of injuries, they were going to win that year too, because they had 5 out of the top 8 coming back, and we had a couple good guys coming up. So we knew they were going to win again, and they did. They actually got named, I think, by the Track and Field News as national champions that year. I think we were good enough in a lot of those years to be national champions. You got to remember, that was 50 years ago. There was no internet. There was really not much event news when they were a monthly magazine, and they were always at least 1 or 2 months behind what was actually going on. And so you never really knew what was going on. Not like nowadays where every week I get an email from DieStat telling me I keep track of all that. And so I know all that now, but back then you didn't know any of that stuff. As a matter of fact, most state associations, you weren't even allowed to run against schools from other states. You were only allowed to stay like in Minnesota or in Michigan or whatever, and you couldn't run against other schools. Nowadays, it's very common to go out and run against other schools in other states.
Southwest had the long success period under the head coach. How smooth was the transition in your junior year to the new coach?
I didn't know this at the time, but my coach told me this actually. He said that when Hallie retired, the athletic director came up to him and said, "So you want the hot seat?" And he goes, "Oh, hell yes." And so he took over, but we could tell why Hallie retired. He had won a state title, so he's going to go out on top, and he was coaching the top 14 guys. 12 of those guys graduated. So he only was going to have 1 or 2 guys coming back. He saw, the B squad guys coming up, but I don't know if I want to have to redo all this. He left out of respect for our program. When we started the year, when I was a junior, we were ranked 3rd in the state behind, I think, White Bear Lake and New Richland or something, just out of respect to the program because we've been so good for so long. And when Hoyt know what he was going to do, what he did was he just got a hold of old diaries and reworked a few workouts, basically was doing basically the same workouts that Hallie was doing. He tweaked them a little bit and put his own little thing in there. But he said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let's just keep going. He had the kids do the 1,000 miles over the summer. And by the way, that's 12.5 miles a day, every day, all summer, just to let you know. I think the key more than anything is that summer running because not everybody does it. But you got
almost nobody did it back then. Here's one thing I think if we reflect, the people listening to this, I think a lot of them will be sitting there and said, "You had an assistant coach for cross country in high school?" I assume you know that this program was fairly unique. It wasn't the only one. Teams at that elite level certainly had similar levels of coaching and summer organization. But it's quite different when we think back to more than 50 years ago, this kind of program.
Oh, yeah. Nowadays, if you look at any of the elite programs, they all do that. But
Right.
back then, hardly anybody did it. However, it's funny. Part of this is memory. I just found this just the other day on Mile Split. They actually have the results from the state meets from way back then in Minnesota. They must have just put them up, as I remember looking a few months ago and they weren't there. I saw the meet that I ran in. It is on there and my name's in there and everything. I couldn't believe it. Mid-pack runners back then. Now remember, we ran 3 miles back then. And here's the thing is 19 was the first year that Minnesota went to 3 miles. So we had only been running 3 miles for a normal distance for a couple, 2-3 years. And on top of that, most states are still doing 2 miles. So to compare across state lines, was hard because as it's a different race running 2 miles than it is running three. It's a different pace scenario. It's hard to compare those. Nowadays, it's real easy to make those comparisons. But back then, it wasn't that easy to compare state to state.
So let me ask something and then it'll come back to you. How had you changed in your mind of your view of yourself as a runner for what would happen when you graduated high school?
It's funny because I knew I was pretty good. I still had 4, 5, 6 teammates that were as good or better than me. But I knew that compared to everybody else, I was pretty good because like in the city of Minneapolis, there was 11 high schools. Everybody ran 7 runners. There were 77 runners. I finished 9th in the city. So I was all city and I was number 6 runner for us that day. And the 3 guys that beat me in the city meet were the number 1 runners from 3 different schools. So I figured, okay, I'm pretty good. Mid-pack runners nowadays compared to mid-pack runners back then, that's the big difference between 50 years ago and now. 50 years ago, I was considered a mid-pack runner almost, or like maybe top 1/3, as opposed to nowadays, if you're a mid-pack runner out of say 225 runners, you're like in 112th place or something. And you're
Yeah.
in like 17 and a half or 18 minutes if you're a guy.
Was your school co-ed?
Yes, it was. But we didn't have girls cross country at the time. We just had boys. Actually, we did have, but it was not an official sanctioned sport through the high school leagues. They ran a couple of meets and said, yes, we ran, but they didn't practice or anything like what we did. They didn't become a sanctioned sport 1975 or 1976 after Title IX and all that stuff. Then all of a sudden the girls' sports went crazy, and that was good. I'm glad they did that because I ended up coaching girls the last 10 years or so that I coached. I was coaching boys and girls, and my girls had more success than my boys did.
When did the idea first occur to you? Did it occur to you while you were in high school that someday I'll be a coach? Someday I'll write a book about my school.
Not the book part, but the coach part, yeah, because I always thought I wanted to be a teacher. I had always been pretty good at mathematics. I'm going to go maybe be a math teacher. I had some pretty good role models in high school for math teachers. My coach was a math teacher. I got accepted to the University of Minnesota engineering school as a freshman, which I thought was pretty prestigious because at the time they had, I think, 3,000 students in their engineering school and they only accepted like 300 freshmen every year. The University of Minnesota is a huge school, 50, 55,000 students. Most of the people that are in the engineering school transferred in from other schools at the university. Well, I thought that's pretty prestigious. I went in as a math major. I had no idea what kind of math or what everything I was getting into because we didn't even have AP classes at my high school when I was going. So we went up through pre-calculus. I go to college. Calculus started out pretty good. And then I hit the wall real fast. I was like, oh my God, but I'm going to stick with it. I stuck it out, got my degree in mathematics, and I changed my mind as far as what I thought I was going to go on to grad school and all that other stuff. Nah, I'm going to take my bachelor's degree, skate out of here and look for a teaching job. About a year later, after I graduated, I went into teaching and I thought, well, if I'm going to teach, I might as well coach too. I thought, what sports can I coach? And I knew I could coach hockey. I could coach baseball. And oh yeah, I can coach cross country too. Cause I went through all that and I've got all my little diaries and stuff that I kept as a runner. So yeah, I think I got a blueprint for that. My first year of teaching, didn't coach cross country in the fall. I was an assistant junior high football coach. But then in the spring, I was assistant track coach.
How much money did you get back in those days?
My first teaching school, I moved 1,200 miles south to Gainesville, Georgia. And my first contract was for $7,600 a year for the whole year. And now it was a boarding school, so they gave us room and board too. We got 3 meals a day and a place to live, and it didn't cost us anything. If we didn't have any money at the end of the month, we could always go to the mess hall and eat in the mess hall. I like to tell folks that when I started teaching, I had been an assistant manager for Walgreens drugstores for about 5, 6 months. making $4 an hour, but I was working 44 hours a week. So I like to tell folks that when I started teaching, my first teaching job, my first year, I took a $2,000 a year pay cut from a $4 an hour job to start teaching. I didn't crack five figures until about my fourth year of teaching. I actually squeaked over $10,000 a year.
Did
And
coaching get you
coach,
anything extra, or was that part of the deal?
no, coaching was not extra. That was the other thing, was everybody was required to do an after school athletic 4 days a week. It was written right into the contract because the boys had to be fit and everything. They didn't actually have a physical education program. That was the physical education program. So right away, I started thinking, if I'm going to do this, I want the kids actually want to be there where they sign up rather than they have to be there for an hour. That's why I was doing the interscholastic coaching. I coached track in the spring, and the guy who was the head cross country head track didn't want to be head cross country anymore because he was in the commandant's office and he was getting more and more busy. And so he recommended that they make me the head cross country coach. And so my second year there, I became head cross country coach. And after about another, I think 1 or 2 years, they made me head track coach. We just basically switched positions. Now, cross country, I was basically by myself, but track, when we switched, then he was my assistant for 1 year. And then he just got so busy, he couldn't do it anymore. And I got somebody else as an assistant, but
What was your personality like as a coach?
different than what it was when I finished. I was a taskmaster to start with because I knew what it was going to take to be successful because I've been there, done that. Having to convince these kids that they had to put in all this work, that was tough to do. What I wound up doing was we would start school on Labor Day. The school was only a part member of the Georgia Association. So we weren't allowed to do postseason stuff. We would start on Labor Day, and about the end of the third week of October, right before region meets, we were done because we weren't allowed to do postseason. So I had 7 weeks to get a schedule in, and we had kids that were coming in that hadn't run a step all summer. Generally, how kids are, generally they're in pretty good physical shape, but they weren't in running shape. Yeah, one of the things I used to tell folks, I go, you can be fit, but are you meat fit? I would get questions like, okay, I've been doing a lot of running on my own, or I've been practicing. It's still not the same as running in the meets, running a race. The question was, how many races do you need to be in optimum racing shape? And it depends on the kid. Some kids can be ready in 2 or 3 races. Some kids, it takes 8, 10 races all season to get them to that point where they're finally racing pretty good at the end of the season. So you have to individualize all that stuff. I convinced the school to let me bring the kids in 2 weeks early before school. We ate, drank, and slept cross country for 2 weeks before school started. We practiced twice a day. We're talking Georgia in August. Okay. We're talking really hot. So we did our main workout at 10 o'clock in the morning and just did a 3 mile maintenance run in the afternoon because it was so darn hot. But we still ran in the afternoon because once school started, that's when we had to practice. I sporadically ran with them a little bit here or there, but I found that running with them, I couldn't supervise them properly. I couldn't stay. I got to the point where I was not in that great a shape compared to my top kids. So I couldn't stay. I was like mid pack or towards the end sometimes. And so it was just hard for me to do everything that I wanted to do. So that basically convinced me I needed to stop running with them. That's when I had to start trusting my captains. I'd say, okay, you're captain. You're my eyes and ears out on this run. If there's people screwing off, I want to know about it. If there's people that are lagging or you think they're hurt or they're sick, you need to tell me about it because they may not want to tell me. They might tell you.
Did your captains tell you?
Yeah, they did. They were pretty good about that. They were pretty good about being my eyes and ears because I told them, I said, look, it's good for the team for you to be able to tell me what's going on. And even in my last few years on my girls, when our region went to state, my two captains were my two high school girls. I had six middle school girls. They came up to me early in the season, go, we don't know how much longer we're going to be able to beat these girls. They're getting that good. And I said, don't tell them that. Encourage them to keep improving and keep running and tell them it's okay to beat you. They don't have to hold back just because you're older. It's okay to beat you. We got that across to them. And actually, my top two runners that year ended up being eighth graders. We had a split from number one to number five or six of less than a minute for 5K. We didn't have that one real big, get that low ticket, but I had enough of a grouping there to where we always did pretty well.
Let me get a frame this for timing. How long did you
Okay.
stay at that school in Georgia? And did you notice either the place or the timing of the world that the cars quit honking and yelling at runners and things? What was going on there?
I started at Georgia in 1978. I stayed there till 85. Then I moved back to Minneapolis. It was probably early 80s when we weren't getting all those bad comments running anymore. It was pretty normal that you'd see people out running. So they stopped yelling at you and they stopped honking and stuff like that. Oh, okay. That's just another one of those million runners out there doing their thing. Plus, all these road races now were getting so populated that they had to, block off streets. So they're like, oh, this must be a big deal. There must be something to this. And so people started paying more attention to it too. It helped that some Americans had some success in the distances. And like Joan Benoit Samuelson won the 84 Olympic marathon. Guys like Steve Scott that ran over 100-mile races where they broke 4 minutes, stuff like that. And that got more and more publicized as you went along. So it became more mainstream. And so it wasn't that big a deal. My kids, when I was coaching, it got to where I didn't have to worry about people trying to run them off the road or anything when they're running. I just had to worry about them because they were kids, which is pretty normal.
I wanted to ask you, when did you leave the bachelor life with being a professional full-time worker and start getting in relationships, family? When did your running tail off significantly? You're like, I'm no longer training.
I ran off and on probably till about 1994, 95, something like that. I turned 40 in 1995. My family is predisposed to be a little bit larger people than normal or whatever. We're all kind of big folks. I was skinniest, of course, when I was running. Even when I put on a little bit of weight, I never had a problem. Like winters in Minnesota were brutal. And I'd go out and play. Yeah, you think? I'd go out and play hockey or something, and that would be most of my exercise during the winter. But then when spring would come along, I didn't have a problem. Oh, it's April. I think it's time to start running again. I could still go and rip off 5 miles and do it in about 35 or 40 minutes and not have too much trouble doing it. As I got older, now I was living back in Minnesota in the late 80s. So I would still, during the winter, as well. As a matter of fact, it's funny, the school where I was teaching, there's a group of us guys, there's about 5 or 6 of us that we all had last period free. And we were all middle school teachers. We decided that we were just going to do a run before school was out because some of us had bus duty and stuff afterwards. We would all do about a 45-minute run last period of the day. Wintertime, we're still out doing our 45-minute run. They were in a little bit better shape than I was, but I still was doing it. And we were still, getting these runs in. I remember running a race in December. The school sponsored a 5K. It was around in the campus. I ran that race a couple of times. It was snow on the ground, everything else. It was cool. I think running in the wintertime is very relaxing because you're outside And basically, you don't hear anybody.
It's
There's not,
quiet in the snow.
yeah,
Yeah, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, not and even later living in Washington, D.C. when the snow fell and you could get out there. It was the most serene place.
yeah. The only thing you hear is your feet hitting the snow. I tell that to people that weren't runners and they don't understand. And I said, it has got to be the most relaxing, serene thing ever because it's just you and outside in the cold, the snow. And you dress for the weather. It's no big deal. Of course, again, I grew up in Minnesota, so you know how to do that. But down here in Louisville, it's 45 degrees. Get out the parkas. I said, what are you going to do when it gets cold? It's like, okay. Finally, about, I'd say early 90s, my running was starting to wane a little bit. I say 1995 because I moved here to Louisville in 92. I still was doing a little bit of running off and on. Not end of 95, I got married. I was teaching at a new school. We had our first kid about a year and a half later. And all of a sudden things were really busy and running just went to the backside a little bit. And I also hurt myself. I don't remember exactly what it was, a hamstring or something, and to the point where I just couldn't run much anymore between teaching full time, having a wife and a small child at home, and coaching two sports on top of it. I just didn't have time to run anymore. It just was not a thing. My kids are grown now, but I'm a walker now. I don't run anymore.
When I used to visit Minneapolis in the summer, mostly, sometimes in the winter, there was a lake and it was about 5K around the lake. Is that there's so many lakes.
Calhoun, Lead Calhoun.
Yes. So I
Yeah.
used to go down, around 2000, I lived in Egypt for 15 years and I was dating a girl that at one point there, and we'd go back and every day I would go down and run around Calhoun and do that 5 mile trek. And it was pretty fun. Yeah. Back then in 2000, by then there were so many recreational runners. Everybody was out. But
But it's funny
what,
that you mentioned Lake Calhoun, though. Where I grew up, I lived about a mile and a quarter from either Lake Calhoun or Lake Harriet. And when I lived there in the late 80s, I was still doing some running. I had all kinds of little routes and everything I could run from.
horses.
I could modify the course and I could start out and I'd go around the west side of Calhoun and then I go, okay, how far do I want to go today? Do I want to do the 6 mile route, the 8 mile route, or the 4 mile route? And depending on how the body felt, it's like, okay, I'm thinking 6 miles today. So I knew where I had to turn to go 6, come back and finish it off. Or I'm going to do 4 today because I'm just not quite feeling it. But I know that from my house around Calhoun and back was about 5 miles.
It's a great place to run. What about the athletes you coach? Were they getting involved in road racing in the summers after school?
Yeah, some of them really wanted to be real active in the summer. And I'd tell them, that's good, but I don't want you to race yourself out either because we have a full schedule in the fall and a full schedule in the spring. And so I would tell them, run a couple road races in the summer just to give you a benchmark of where you are, to let you see where your fitness is and how your training's going. But I don't want to see you doing weekly road races because that's going to burn you out. Matter of fact, it's funny about that. I had a kid at the first school I taught here in Louisville. He told me right up front, really smart kid. He told me right up front, Coach, I run cross country to be ready for track because he loved track. He was an 800-meter runner. And I was like, that's cool. I said, you're still part of the team. And he was still one of the better runners on the cross country team. He wasn't great, but he was okay. But he was getting ready for track. His junior season in track, he was the indoor 800-meter champion in Class A, the small schools. He won the region meet for the second year in a row and then finished like 7th or 8th in the state. Runs during the summer. We get into cross country. All of a sudden, he gets out and it's about end of September or so. He's running these meets where he's going along and the first mile he looks good. And then it's almost like someone dropped about a 50-pound rock on his back and he can't go. He said, Coach, I have no energy left. I said, okay, come to me. have you had any time off since January? Like I told you to? Oh no. He ran straight through from January. I always told my kids to take at least a 2-week break at the end of track before you start running for cross country in the summer. Then we always would take a little bit of a break here or there. About the time summer ends and the racing season begins, we take a little bit of a break just to refresh yourself. He didn't take any time off. He was just stale. He couldn't go. I said, okay, unfortunately, there's nothing much we can do the rest of this season. So we're just going to go with what you got. But at the end of this season, which for you will be the region meet, because I know you won't make it to state, you're going to take for that time until January. I don't care what you do, don't run. You
When
can
you
play
had the
basketball.
guys in the summer program hitting that 1,000 miles, 12 and a half miles a day, was that 7 days a week?
Yeah, when we were doing that back in the 70s, we figured out that was 7 days a week. Now, when we started running with Coach, we in Minnesota, and I think this is still the same rule, you're not allowed to start running with the coach till the middle of August. Now, here in Kentucky, it's a month earlier. You can start July 15th. When I first started coaching here in Kentucky, I thought that was too early. I always told my kids, we're not going to start till August 1st. I said, up until that point, that's you running on your own. Then August 1st, you're with me and we'll start. Because we weren't allowed to start having any meets until the end of August, 1st of September anyway. You could have 1 or 2 scrimmage meets, but nothing for sure. The way they timed it here in Kentucky was you can't start having real meets until the Tuesday after the first football game, whenever that was. That usually ended up being like the last week of August. I said, starting August 1st, that's plenty of time. Then when I started coaching at my last school, I could see where they were basically starting over completely. And they needed not only help physically, but they needed help mentally and culturally. They had no idea what running culture was, how to think as a runner or anything. I said, we're starting July 15th just to get you guys thinking the right way. No, we're not going to practice 7 days a week. I stopped doing that a long time ago. I always gave my kids Sundays off. Now at Southwest, we ran on Sundays too. We ran it 7 days a week, but I always gave my kids Sundays off. And in fact, my younger kids, when I had my middle school kids, I would only run them 4 or 5 days a week because I didn't want to burn them out. Their muscles are still developing and there's no reason to kill them like that. Now I would tell them, I'd give them the option. I'd go, okay, you can run more if you want to. You don't have to. Here's the mandatory days you have to be here. If you have a day where you think you still want to run, you feel like you can run, come to practice. If I think it's detrimental, I'm shutting you down. But if you can handle it and it looks to me like you're handling it, I'm going to let you go. And that's the way we did that. The year that my girls were so good at Walden was because they all decided that they still wanted to run. Now, some of them took their days off a little bit here or there, which is fine. That was no problem. We started actually doing some 2-a-days. The middle school kids, I didn't have them doing 2-a-days. I told them, you come to one of those practices each day. I don't care which one you come to. But the high school kids, no, you're coming both times. We didn't do 2-a-days every day. It was about maybe 3 days a week, maybe one of 3/4 out of 18 years where I didn't start teaching at the university until 10 o'clock in the morning. And so I said, okay, 8 o'clock practice. And we did that on like Monday, Wednesday, Thursday. Couldn't do it on Friday because I had to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning for office hours. And then we always were going to have a morning practice on Saturday for a long run. That was the other thing is I think a key is that long run day, either every week or every other week. You put in a run equal to 3 or 4 times what your normal race distance is. It's more psychological than anything else. If you can handle 10 miles, 3 is a piece of cake. Yeah, it's still good for you cardiovascularly and everything else, but it's also psychologically, hey, I just did 10 miles. I can run that 3-mile race. That's not going to be a problem. So that
Let me
another
ask you
reason I'm
about the
doing that. Go ahead.
Minnesota running scene. Were you plugged into the running scene, Ron Dawes, and some of the other world-class runners that would go to that race?
I knew about them. I wasn't acquainted with any of them, but I knew of them. Steve Hogue, Ron Dawes, Dick Beardsley, guys like that. I knew about all the good Minnesota runners. I didn't know them personally, but I kept track of them. There's a organization, I think it's still going, the Minnesota Distance Runners Association. But I was a member of that for a while back in the mid to late 70s. And then, of course, I moved away from Minnesota, so I stopped my membership. But I was with them through college and a little bit after college. And it's a good organization. They have those pods where they have those Olympic level runners that run in different areas. Minneapolis has one of those. The Twin Cities has one of those. I don't remember who the coach is or anything now, but they started that, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago because it's a nice place to run. It's a great place to train. There's buku, millions of places where you can go and run. And that's one of the things that, speaking about culture, I was at the military school where I first started coaching, was they wanted us to always run on the track. I go, yeah, we will in track season. I said cross country, and this is the same thing at Walden here in town. The headmaster wanted us always to be using the track. I go, yeah, we will be during track season, but cross country is not run on a track. It's run on grass and dirt and mud and hills, and there ain't none of those over there, the track. So that's why we got to go to the parks and run. And the more different terrains and different scenes and scenarios that you can encounter in practice, the less bad stuff is going to happen to you during a race. And that's one of the things that Coach Hoisington, who's my coach, he was all over preparation. He was constantly talking to us about preparation. We ran on golf courses, we ran hills, we ran around lakes, we ran on roads, we ran on dirt paths. We were all over the place. And he wanted to make sure that we hit all the different terrains, all the different types of things. He talked to us about what you ate before a race. What do you eat during the day? That's
So this
one of
is
the
in the
things.
70s. He was talking
This
about
th
nutrition.
Yeah, this is in the '70s. Every afternoon after practice, there was this spring by Lake Harriet. There's a pump that you got spring water, gallon jug, 3-gallon, something like that. And he would get spring water every day, and it's nice and cold, drinkable, and then he'd take that to practice. At the end of practice in the afternoon, every day with our water, we would take wheat germ, vitamin E, and vitamin C every
My
day.
God.
And by the way, that came out of his pocket. He would buy that stuff himself and he would try to get reimbursed by the school. I don't know if he ever did, but all that stuff came out of his pocket.
Did you take any of those ideas and implement any of those with your teams, this nutrition
Yes,
or vitamin stuff?
later on with my later teams, all the kids had their own little water bottles with them. So I didn't supply water. But before that, I always had a jug of water at practice. I said, especially down in Georgia, you got to stay hydrated because it's hot. I had one kid down in Georgia who passed out at afternoon practice because of the heat. He ended up being in the hospital overnight one night because he had heat prostration. And then we couldn't let him run for 4 or 5 days until he had recovered completely from it. But yeah, the water and the preparation for meets. I always knew that you would take a good slug of water, maybe 45 minutes to an hour before you're going to run. 45 minutes before race time, you start your warm up. You go ahead and jog, do some stretching, a little more jogging, then come back to the blankets. I always had a tarp down with blankets, come back to the blankets, have a nice place to sit and stretch. Now, later on, it got more fancy. We had tents with everything like that. Nowadays, everybody has tents and come back and stretch. That's where the camp was. You leave, do your run out, ready to go. And I tried to get them into a routine because one of the things I learned from Hoisington was the more you get into a routine on race day, the less the runner has to think about and they can concentrate on their race. But the other thing I learned from him, and I sometimes didn't get this across to the kids as well as I wanted to, was what's your race plan? What are you going to do today? What are your splits going to be from this race? Are you going to go out quickly? because sometimes you didn't know the course. You weren't quite sure how you're going to see a little bit touchy feely a little bit at the beginning. But if it was a course you'd run before, you knew what to expect on the course. So you didn't have to worry about that part. Just, okay, who's my competition today? And I'd tell them, look, this is where running your own race comes in. You need to think about how you want to run your race. If you do your race, everything else will fall in. And one of the things that I also did, again, try to get this across to the kids during training, every time you run a training run, unless I tell you otherwise, I want you to finish that training run with a hard finish. My definition and Coach Hoisington's definition of a hard finish, though, were a lot of times different from the kids. Their definition of a hard finish is, oh, I have 100 meters to go. That's not a hard finish. It's a nice show for the fans, but it's not a hard finish. Hard finish is last 800 to 1,000 meters. You're now accelerating. Every step, you're going a little bit faster. Every time you're building into that sprint. And I tell them, I go, last 800 to 1,000 meters, nobody passes you. You're doing the passing. You've been practicing this way. This is what you're going to do. You should just kick in. Of course, I get some smart aleck kid going, what if the guy is a whole lot better than me that I'm running next to? I'd go, newsflash, he won't be there. He's going to be way ahead of you all. If he's that much better than you and you've only got a half a mile to go in the race, he's already got you beat. You don't have to worry about him. You just worry about the people that are around you. But you should not get past in those last 800 to 1,000 meters. You should be doing the passing. And if you've done your workouts the right way, that should happen all the time.
Running, racing is not a sport that has ice hockey 2 breaks or halftime where the
No.
coach can talk to the kids. So what
No.
did you do in terms of debriefing after races?
If I could see anything during the race, because you know how cross country races are, they're so spread out and everything. And me not being as mobile as I used to be, I couldn't see everything. And I wanted to be at the end to get their final time, if for nothing else. I can think of a couple courses here in town where I could actually get some splits because the split places were right near the finish line. So I could just get there, get the splits, get them written down, and then get back to the finish line. Of course, nowadays, just about every meet is fully automatic timed. So getting back to the finish line is probably not that important anymore. But getting those intermediate splits, I think, is really important because I can analyze the race and see what they were doing and say, hey, your middle mile was not very good. You did this on your first mile and this on your last mile. What happened in between here? For example, at the state meet where my girls ran, the course is at Kentucky Horse Park. The first mile and the last mile are relatively flat. They're not real flat, but it's pretty flat. The middle mile has a couple of big, so you expect the middle mile to be a little slower. The good news at the Kentucky Horse Park is that they have a mat at each mile marker. So I didn't even have to take splits. I could just be out on the course yelling, and I got the splits at the end of the race. And I could look at them and go, oh, okay, we did well here. This was okay. But the last split is the 1.1. And so you figure that's going to be a little bit slower too. But a lot of my girls, their last 1.1 was faster than their middle mile, which tells me, because one of the things I thought was they went out too fast on that first mile, because a lot of them were right around 6 minutes. A couple of them were under 6 minutes, which is faster than they'd gone all year. But I told them to go out and get out. I told them to get out. I said, hey, you got to get out because everybody else is going to get out. Holding back, that's not the way you guys have been racing. Just get out with everybody else. And they did. And we were 6th at the mile, 7th at the 2 mile, and 6th at the end of the race. Did they go out too fast? No. And the fact that they finished really strong tells me that they didn't go out too fast. But at the end of a normal race where you don't have stuff like that, if I see them in the intermediate parts of the race, I'll tell them, I'll go, look, that person there shouldn't be ahead of you. You need to be ahead of that person. You need to beat that person. And sometimes they just need to be reminded that they're racing because they get into those doldrums a little bit especially if you lose contact with somebody and you're just racing by yourself, all of a sudden you're going a lot slower than you're capable of because you got nobody around you, which is one of the things at Southwest we were always told, okay, you've now passed this person, jettison that person. Your goal is the next person ahead of you. And you just keep trying to pass people for the entire race. You don't want to leave people ahead of you. Don't ask permission to go by them. If they're going too slow, just go around them and move along and go on to the next person. That's one of the things I tried to get across to my runners to go, look, you don't have to be social and stay with this person. If they're going too slow, just go by them. Don't ask, just go. I always wrote up a summary of the meet afterwards. I would get on my computer, put their splits in if I got splits, put in their final times, put in how I thought the meet went, give the final score of the meet, get it copied off and give it to them to practice the next day. We'd go over it in more detail the next day. But I always wanted them to have a hard copy of what the meet was so that they had an idea of how they did, not only in comparison to their teammates, but in comparison to everybody they ran against. Now, some of these meets, we were a small team. We were going against these big schools. I told them, I go, look, I don't care what happens with St. X. I don't care what Assumption does. They're big schools. They're in a different class. When it comes to postseason, we don't care about them. All I care about is how you do against these smaller schools. And that's all I'm going to worry about. So I want to see how we do against the little schools at the end of the day. If you end up beating some of the big schools, wonderful. If you don't, that's okay. I don't care about that. All I care about is our competition. It doesn't matter what the color of the uniform is. If they're near you, you got to try to beat them. You got to go with them and try to beat them. It's being competitive.
Let me ask you about your transition out of coaching. How did you end your career there? And then I want to ask you about your whole process of writing the book, running high school cross country the Southwest way.
I had an unwritten rule. If I don't teach there, I shouldn't coach there because I saw guys and girls that would come in to coach and they didn't teach there. I saw the difficulties, like they don't know who was in school today, blah, blah, blah. They don't know what's going on. And then all of a sudden they get to practice and part of their team's not there. And I said to myself, I don't want to do that. So what happens, the last 3 places I coached at a place where I was not teaching. And after I left St. Francis, I started teaching at local college here. And I thought, coaching wise, I'm done. I actually coached at one of St. Francis's competitors for 1 year, coached track. We did okay. I coached the boys track team. We finished 4th in the state. They didn't invite me back or anything. I was like, okay. So I was also a registered official. So I was getting my fix by officiating. I thought I was done. And then a guy was coaching one of the local public schools. He was looking for somebody who could be his assistant cross country coach. And I saw the name and I recognized the name. God, this guy's a good coach. He coached at another school who had 3 or 4 state championships. I debated whether or not I wanted to do it. So I said, okay, yeah, I'll apply. And so he said, come on in for an interview. We talked. This is where I actually met him and we're still friends today. He said, Paul, I want you to be my coach. I have to go run through the athletic director, but to be my assistant coach. I looked at him and go, I have a reputation. And he goes, yeah, it's a pretty good one too. I said, oh, okay. All right, sounds good to me. So I was his assistant for a couple of years. He left. I became the head cross country coach for about 2 years. And then something happened where I didn't do a clinic or something. And again, something got lost in translation because I wasn't at the school. And so they got rid of me. I was like, okay. So I figured that was it. I was done coaching, wasn't going to be coaching anymore. Then about 2018, I think it was. Yeah. Coaches Listserv, which by the way doesn't exist anymore, but Coaches Listserv, athletic director at Walden, puts out a feeler in January. I need a track coach. I'm thinking to myself, this is late to be looking for a track coach. Hasn't track season already started? And I thought about it, said, nah, I don't want to do it. I don't want to start in February with a track team that should have started a month and a half ago. So I didn't do it. A couple months later, he puts out another one for the following fall for cross country. I was thinking, okay, do I still want to do this? Because I'd been out of coaching for about 3 years. And I thought, I'm familiar with the school, more or less, their region, because it's the same region that St. Francis was in. Okay, I'll apply. So I applied for it. He hired me because I was the only one who applied. He loved me. He was a good guy. I liked him. I liked him a lot. And so I ended up staying there for 4 years. But in the interim, while I was there, that was my girls' team that did really well. But you talk about this, the school where I had to change the culture completely because they had no idea what a running culture even was. I was lucky, fortunate enough to have a woman who was the mother of one of my runners as my parent rep, who helped me put stuff out and kept me on task a little bit. And she became a good friend and she was really nice. And she is Filipino, which is my wife's Filipino. So we connected there too. In that period of time, my parents passed away, and both of them within 2 days of each other in 2016.
Yeah.
That threw me off completely. As good as 2015 was, 2016 sucked. And so got through the track season. I had 8 girls on the cross country team the year before, won the region, had the one girl as a senior. She's going to graduate. All 3 of my 8th grade girls transferred to different schools. I went from having 8 girls and a really good team to 4 girls scrambling to find a 5th girl to even have a full team. And it turns out it was the culture at Walden. 8th grade, they take off and go to other schools. So that killed me a little bit. With my parents passing away and that, I was like, you know what? This just isn't that important anymore. I don't want to do this anymore because practice started to become drudgery. You know what? I really don't even want to go to practice anymore. The meets were okay. After the first of the year in 2017, I got track started. I was looking for an assistant track coach because I needed somebody else to help me. Couldn't find anybody. And then a director, 1st of February, saying, come in and see me. Went in. It was a new athletic director, by the way. The old guy had been let go at the end of the previous year. This guy was a brand new guy. And so I was not his guy. I wasn't hired by him. And he said, we've decided to go in a different direction. We're going to have somebody else. I said, so, well, okay, so I'm done. Yeah. All right. See ya. And that was it. That was the end of my coaching. Although I was at the state meet because I was still officiating. So I officiated the 2017, the 2018, 20.
Let's talk about the process of writing the book. You wrote a long-term history of running high school cross country the Southwest way.
Back in the 90s, I started thinking, how good were we really overall? And I think it was 1997, Stillwater High School, Minnesota was named national champions by this magazine called The Harrier, which doesn't exist anymore. And I was thinking, and he published their times. So I made the adjustment compared to our times. We beat the crap out of it. So I was thinking, how good were we? So I started thinking back. I go, we had to be pretty good. And finding stuff from 50 years ago is virtually impossible. There's nothing there. You can find little snippets and little pieces, but that's it. So I thought, you know what? Someone's got to let people know how good we were back then. And I thought, who better than me? 30 something years. Why not? And I wasn't coaching anymore. So I thought, I'll give it a shot, see what happens. And so I talked to my old coach who was still active. He was in his 80s, close to 90, but he sent me some stuff. And one of my former runners, teammates, had digitized his diaries from his first 3 years, 1971, 72, and 73. Coach Hoisington sent me some stuff from the state high school league. So it goes all the way back to when they first started having state cross country meets in 1942. And I started compiling things. I go, God, we won that one. We won that one. Did a second there. We won one. I was like, holy God, we won a lot of these things. Turns out that we had such a rich history, which I pretty much knew anyway, but I hadn't actually quantified it. I figured someone's got to write this down. So I started the book, writing about the Halley years. He was there for 28 years. They won 14 state titles under him. In other words, half the state titles.
Who did you write the book for and what was the reception?
I wrote the book for me because I wanted to write all this stuff down. I wrote the book for other runners who ran for Southwest. I wrote the book for just people that went to Southwest because it's a history of something that went on at Southwest. And I also wrote it for kids that are runners that maybe they can learn something from this and make themselves better runners. Because there are little tips and stuff throughout the book of what makes a good runner, what makes not so good runner, how you can improve yourself, things like that. And I think the history part of it is there, if nothing else, for inspiring someone to say, hey, they were pretty good. Maybe we could be that good too. And so I did it for a lot of different reasons and a lot of different groups of people, but I mainly my teammates and the guys that came before me. But also I wanted to brag a little bit about the school because, hey, we were pretty good for 38 years. And a lot of folks don't realize that. Just recently, I had a 50-year high school class reunion. So leading up to that, one of my classmates called me to remind me of the reunion. I said, by the way, Louisa, did you know that there's two things I wanted to tell her? I said, did you know that the high school has started a Hall of Fame? She didn't know that. And did you know that I wrote a book? She didn't know that. I said, okay. So I just wanted to tell you that. And I said, I think what would be a great thing at the reunion would be to recognize the people in our senior class that are in the hall. Well, there's four of us, me, Mark Holland, John Czar, and the guy who was our class president, Jay Pivick, who ended up being a very good college basketball coach. And we're it. We had 420 people in our graduating class. We're the only four people from our class that are in the Hall of Fame. So I said, I thought it would be a good idea to recognize us at the 50th reunion. She goes, I think that's a great idea. And by the way, you wrote a book and we'll raffle it off at the dinner. Oh, sure. So I and about 5 other people that had written books all donated our books and they got raffled off at the dinner.
So what's next? You've written the book. Are you still an official or are you still a fan of the sport?
Oh yeah, I'm still a fan of the sport. I was camped this past summer watching the world championships of track and field and then the Diamond League finals. I was watching those. And by the way, as a matter of fact, I got a little perturbed. There's a guy, I'm sure you've heard of Yared Nuguse. He set the American record in the mile at the Diamond League. Okay. He's a local kid. He went to Manual High School. I saw him run as a high school runner. The local news here, none of them said anything about him finishing 5th in the world in the 1500 meters or setting the American record. And the one channel that I watch all the time, I wrote into them a scathing email saying, what is your problem? You guys talk about all this local stuff and high school sports and everything. And you have a kid here who's a local kid who goes on and does all this in the world, on the world stage, his first year on the world stage, and you don't even mention it.
Did your scathing communication have any impact? Did something?
Yeah, they finally mentioned it a little bit the next week. They didn't give me any credit, which was fine. I didn't care about that. But I was like, you got this kid who was,
Of course. It's news.
local kid.
Yeah.
And I said, if that's not news, I don't know what is. And then also, we had our state cross country meet a week ago Saturday. They talked about high school sports on Friday nights. And then again, the half-hour thing Saturday. They tell you the state results for soccer, the state results for football, the state results for volleyball. They even have field hockey here, which they call it state, but
I think you're heading towards they don't report cross country. Why do you think
no,
that is?
they don't. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me because some of the best distance runners in the entire state are right here in Jefferson County.
I have an idea.
What's that?
I have an idea for a new career for you. Freelance sports reporter to raise the awareness of all the good things happening in high school sports there.
You know
You
what?
sound like you know it.
That's not a
You've
bad
got,
idea.
you've got the passion. That's great.
Yeah, it just lost me because I told him, I go, look, you had 100 schools running in the same place and 1,500 runners all running in the same place on the same day in about a 7-hour period, and you couldn't even get somebody over there to report on that. And in the big schools, the teams that were state champions in the big schools were both from here. In fact, the girls team is ranked 23rd in the country, and they've not made any mention of that at all. I know the coach, he's a friend of mine. They're going to run it in the Nike Cross Regionals here in 2 weeks. And they're ranked 3rd in their region. They got a shot to make it to Nike Cross Nationals. And I haven't heard a word
Right.
about that.
All right. I thank you for all your time today, Paul. It's great talking to you and hearing these stories. And hopefully, now you're all fired up and you're going to write another letter. I think that would be great because you are passionate. And as a published author, you not only have a reputation for what you did as a runner, as a coach, and now as an author, you have a lot of standing. I think it's time to use that crowbar.
I think you got a good idea there. I actually have thought about that, and I'm thinking that maybe since I got a little bit extra time on my hands, maybe I should start doing that.
All right, let's cut this off. I think I'm going to have to edit this into a couple episodes. We went, there's lots of good long stories. People will certainly really enjoy hearing this. You have a good memory, lots of good stories, mentioned a lot of people. So I think it's going to be like your book. It will be appreciated by a lot of different people in the audience. People who've never coached, coaches are going to love it. I want to thank you for all your time, Paul.
All right. Thank you, Matthew.
I hope you enjoyed another episode of Running in the 70s. Voices, stories, and memories of athletes who were running in the 70s. Until next time, wherever you are, keep looking forward and don't forget to look back.